But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. Let me tell you about my great God. Hey guys, Pastor Tim here. Hope you guys are doing great. Hope you're ready to start your day off in God's Word. We are finishing, finally, 2 Samuel. We're about to move on right into 1 Kings. And for the conclusion of a book of David's life, it definitely doesn't really end on a high note or a good note. Now, granted, at the end of the chapter, things are reconciled and made right again. But this chapter, this book, ends with one of David's greatest sins, so to speak. Now, many of the times when we think about David's greatest sin, we think of David's sin with Bathsheba when he committed adultery with her back in chapter 11 or 12. But here you can say this is David's greatest sin due to the mere impact it has on not just David, but on all of Israel. Now, the sin with Bathsheba, the snowball effect of sin, has it just continue to get bigger and bigger. It did have a very big impact on the nation as well, but this one had a very big impact immediately. And what happened here, all right, and before we go any further, I just wanted to be clear that you should never really get into a habit of measuring sin, so to speak. Remember, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. It doesn't matter what that sin is. Sin is sin in God's eyes. But we see here just more from just just to help us view what's going on here. We see something that David does that has a very huge impact right away on those around him. And you guys heard me say that many times before about how your sin affects more than just yourself. So anyway, to what's going on in this chapter, David sins by counting the people. He does a census. Not that a census itself is evil or wrong, but it's the heart behind it, his pride, and his ego kind of coming to the forefront and kind of numbering his military power. Because we see here in the chapter, the number he's really caring about is just like how many valiant men he has, and it kind of shows a heart that now trusts more in what he's accomplished and what he has at his disposal as the king of Israel, rather than his trust in God and how God has provided him victory and how God will continue to be his arm of protection. He now seems to be focusing more on his own armies and what he himself can do. All right, and God punishes him for that. Now, a very interesting thing, if you're just reading this chapter alone at the very first verse, it may seem confusing. You're like, wait a minute, did God cause David to sin? Is God the one that made David do it? It said God was displeased with Israel. So besides David at this point, it's obvious that Israel itself, the people, are not living in a way that is glorifying unto God. In fact, it displeases God very much. And this will sound familiar to you in many different instances before here, all the way to the beginning of the Bible. We think of the time of Noah's day, and all the people on the earth were wicked and doing evil things continually. We think of the book of Judges, and all the times the people of Israel were disobeying God, and God was displeased with them, and he had to punish them for that sin. And we come to the same thing here in this chapter. God is displeased with Israel, and he allows this thing to happen. He allows David to do this, all right, and he uses it as an occasion to punish Israel as well. But it's very important to understand that God does not make you sin. All right, think of James chapter 1. When we are drawn to sin, it's not God that does that. It's our own temptation, our own flesh and lust. And if you want a very good parallel chapter to read with this, and I encourage you guys to do it, it is 1 Chronicles. Whoa, what? Never read Chronicles. I don't even go to that book. Yes, 1 Chronicles chapter 21. All right, that's 1 Chronicles chapter 21. If you want to read it, it'll be a very good parallel with this chapter. It talks about all the same things, and it's very apparent in the very first chapter of that, very first verse of that chapter, that it was Satan who was tempting David to sin. God allowed Satan to do this, much like a Job situation when God allowed Satan to inflict Job and try to tempt him to curse God and die. He was allowing Satan to do this as well, to tempt David to number the people, to grow in his pride, and God used that occasion, David's sin, to also punish the people of Israel for how they've been living as well. That's a lot of stuff, all right? That's a lot of stuff just for the very first verse of the chapter, what's happening here. David goes out, try to get through the rest of this pretty quick. He goes out, he does this. It takes a while to number the people, all right? It took, and the chapter says it took about 9 months for him to finally finish numbering all the people. And think about that. That's 9 months in which David could have come to his senses and realized, you know what I'm doing is wrong. I should not continue in this. But he didn't. He continued on, and it wasn't until after he finally got the numbers, when Joab told him, you have this many valiant men, not just men, but this many valiant men, men that could be part of your army. This is how strong your military might is, David. Forget God. This is how strong your military is. It is when David finally gets the numbers that he realized, he's smote in his heart. He's convicted. Oh, I have sinned against God. I was trusting myself. I was not trusting in the Lord, but it was too late. All right, and God actually, he does this, I don't know if your parents have ever done this with you, but he actually proposes to David, hey, all right, you've done wrong. I'm going to give you the choice. What do you think should be done to you? All right, and if your parents have ever done that to you in the past, oh, that's like the worst situation to be in. All right, you can be grounded, you can get a whooping, you can, whatever it is. That's kind of what God was doing here. All right, and there were several different things. He could have had years of famine. He could have chosen 3 months on the run from his enemies in the wilderness. And I'm sure David doesn't want anything to do with that anymore. He's tired of running away from his enemies in the wilderness from Saul and Absalom. Or 3 days of pestilence or a plague in the land. And David chooses the 3 days of a plague. And it doesn't last 3 days. All right. But in that first day itself, the angel of death, is said in this chapter, slays with the plague 70,000 people. So once David's convicted of his sin, God gives him the option to choose his punishment. The immediate impact of this sin greatly affects Israel. All right, and once again, God's using this as an occasion to punish Israel as well. And David, he intercedes for the people of Israel, seeing this, and he says, "Why would you do this to these sheep? You know, let this be upon my head, upon my household." Now, David wasn't calling them sheep as in like a derogatory term, like my people are nothing but like livestock to me. No, it's a very affectionate way, because remember, David is a shepherd, all right? So he views sheep very much as a very valuable and precious thing to him, just as his people were valuable and precious to him, and he did not want to see them slain by this plague. So God tells him, all right, he gives him the opportunity to confess and to sacrifice and burnt offering unto the Lord. And David goes to a certain place where the angel of the death stopped at, and he offers a sacrifice in the Lord. But he had to first, it was on someone else's property. And by all means, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the person. I'll put him right here on the bottom. But he goes to this man's property, all right, and he says, hey, can we offer a sacrifice to the Lord right here? And the man says, of course, anything you need, King, I will give it to you. All right, and David says, no, I don't want you to just give it to me. All right, I'm going to buy it from you. I'm going to buy all your land. I'm going to buy all the livestock I'm going to use to offer this offering, all right, because he doesn't want to offer a cheap offering. It's like, it would mean nothing if this didn't cost me anything. All right, let me buy it from him. And this is kind of where I get my main point. I'm sorry this is a longer video, but sorry about that. But this is where I kind of get my main point for today's chapter. All right, is David he understood that sacrifice or confession unto the Lord, it took work and it would cost him something. All right, when we serve God, all right, we can't expect to serve God and not put in any effort of ourselves. We can't expect to ride on the coattails of our parents. Teenagers, don't think you can ride on the coattails of your parents for your Christianity, for your whole life, because there's going to come a day when you have to be responsible between yourself and God alone. When you have to make the decision that I want to sacrifice time in my life to study God's word, to serve him, to glorify him in my life. I can't just depend on what my parents' reputation is. I cannot just depend on what my youth group does and just kind of go along with what they're doing in their activities. All right, I can't even rely on what the church is doing. Like, if your church doesn't have a weekly visitation, that doesn't mean you don't go out and tell people about the Lord. No, you put in your time, you sacrifice of yourself to serve and glorify God. And David understood that. Hey, I'm not going to take of your stuff freely. Let me buy it, all right? Because a cheap sacrifice is no better than no sacrifice, all right? And he knew it would cost him something, so he paid for the land. He paid for the oxen as well to sacrifice unto the Lord, and the God stayed the plague then and there. Sorry about that, guys. It's a long video, but a lot of great stuff in here, all right, that we see. Do read 1 Chronicles chapter 21 just so you get a good parallel of what's happening more completely in this chapter. And I hope to see you guys again when we start 1 Kings chapter 1 tomorrow.